Good morning, everybody. I am John Simoes, and I'm here on behalf of Protect Our Care New Hampshire to talk about what's going on this week in Congress with the Medicaid budget. It's May 15th, 2025, and this week the House Energy and Commerce Committee finalized a plan to slash over 700 billion, that's with a B, dollars over a 10-year period from the national Medicaid budget to help fund tax breaks for the very wealthy. Uh, this proposal is suggesting new work requirements and a much harsher eligibility criteria for Medicaid recipients. Here in New Hampshire alone, we think these cuts could jeopardize care for about 200,000 Granite Staters, including up to 60,000 children, 20,000 seniors, and 25,000 people with disabilities. These changes could very much put at risk lives in New Hampshire, especially in rural communities. It could do that by closing smaller hospitals and placing a severe strain on our healthcare infrastructure, not to mention our state budget. So I'm very fortunate this morning to have two guests to help break this down and talk about it. Christin H is the founder and principal of Putney Consulting, and Sam Burgess is the healthcare policy coordinator at New Futures. Christin and Sam, thanks for being here. I'm going to ask a few questions. I'll just throw it out there, hop in and answer as you see appropriate. And then at the end, my colleague Rachel will join us if we have any questions from the folks who have tuned in. So first, that was my understanding from the recent articles, but how would these proposed federal Medicaid funding reductions impact access to care for New Hampshire residents, specifically, kids, seniors, and people with disabilities? What do you see as the impact?
Christin, would you like to start?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Chaim. At the basic level, reduction in care and services is going to affect those that need to use the services the most. Those are low-income individuals. Medicaid is used more by women in New Hampshire and by children and individuals with disabilities. It also is covering kind of the gap in Medicare services for low-income older adults too. And so right away, those are going to be where we see the biggest impacts for people that need to access care for health, for preventative care, maternal and behavioral health care too.
Sam?
Definitely. Yeah, no, and just going off that as well. Looking at a few of the major provisions in the bill proposed by the House, as you said at the beginning, John, we have work requirements proposed. There's going to be an increase in redeterminations that people on Medicaid are going to be forced to go through from one a year to twice a year. And there's going to also be a freeze on provider taxes, which is a way in which most states, including New Hampshire, seek to fund their portion of the Medicaid bill that they share with the federal government. We can get more into each of them. I'll say, for instance, if you talk about redeterminations, this is just putting up additional administrative hurdles for people that need this healthcare, this necessary healthcare. And whether it's a feature or a bug of the proposal, it's going to result in an increased disenrollment on the rolls for Medicaid in New Hampshire. If you make people drive, pregnant people, disabled people, people with children, a second time a year to a local benefits office, it could, these are people who maybe cannot or don't feel empowered to go through these administrative processes. So again, whether it's a feature or a bug, these redeterminations, these work requirements, they're going to result in increased disenrollment, and they're also going to come with a pretty steep administrative price tag for the federal government and potentially the state government.
Well, that's a perfect transition to my next question, because as we're speaking, the New Hampshire Senate is looking at their budget for the coming year, and this is a lot of money off the table for New Hampshire. So, what are the potential financial implications for our state budget as we're debating how big the deficit could be? And again, we're not supposed to have a deficit, but also part two, what does it mean for rural hospitals across New Hampshire if these Medicaid dollars disappear?
Yeah, I think when you look down the road, which is always hard to do when you're trying to do a budget for right now, that's where you really see how the impacts are going to cost New Hampshire in the long term. Because when you talk about preventative care and access to that care, you're talking about reduction in health costs down the road. And when you talk about rural health and the impact of loss of patients paying at the hospital or the healthcare center, that means that hospital has to reduce their services, reduce their size, and potentially lay off everybody in another area. So then it's loss of jobs in a rural region that's already struggling with infrastructure around jobs and transportation, which Sam, you brought up too. Transportation is a big issue. And then you're looking at the impact of people with loss of work potentially too. So there's a whole population of people that are taking care of other people that are paid through Medicaid because they are disabled and they need an in-home care person. And it might be their spouse or another family member or just someone that's caring for them. And so all of a sudden that piece goes away too. So it really can have long-term impacts for the state financially that making cuts now become short-sighted in.
Yeah, piggybacking off those great comments, I think we in New Hampshire are already in a rural healthcare workforce crisis at this point. You know, I think in this current state budget, we're actually already cutting the state loan repayment program to those who are to healthcare workers who are serving underserved areas of the state. So it's going like everything else with Medicaid, it's going to be amplified. Cuts are going to be amplified in rural communities. You know, the average the average hospital relies on about 20% of its revenue coming from Medicaid. And that's with an even higher share going towards low income and rural areas. So Medicaid is a lifeline to these hospitals, and the effects of these cuts are going to be just amplified in rural communities.
Yeah. And really, you know, we're talking about a lot of times this perinatal care access. You know, that's a huge population. That's, I think about 25, roughly quarter of births in New Hampshire are paid for through Medicaid. So that's a lot of women and children that are receiving services in rural areas as well. There's higher percent in rural areas. So now all of a sudden there's going to be lack of providers in the area. The hospital may be closing. That means someone has to travel really far to get that care, especially in an emergency situation or in a live birth. So this is going to result in, you know, death. This is going to result in developmental delay potentially for someone in an emergency situation that baby can't maybe get the emergency services it needs right away. And, you know, that those impacts just keep growing over time. The same with behavioral health. There is a crisis. New Hampshire has a higher percentage of youth, and particularly young girls, that are having that report having anxiety and depression, and there are behavioral health issues that are higher in New Hampshire than in many of the other states. And so what are we doing to serve those kids and give them services if we're cutting back the availability of them getting the service or the providers that provide that service? And there's already a shortage right now. People are waiting to find care for their children. And those are New Hampshire residents. Those are our communities that then have to take up and try and help where there's a lack. And it puts the burden on everybody. It doesn't save. It puts the burden back on everyone again.
And John, if you don't let me, that reminds me as well. I think those are all great points. And I think as we've already mentioned, this is either going to result in healthcare deserts in rural areas, but also what Christin mentioned makes me think of Frisbee Memorial, and we have an accelerating trend of hospital consolidation here in New Hampshire. So it's very possible if you cut off this necessary revenue stream for a lot of these rural hospitals, they're going to feel the need to potentially go along with that trend and consolidate like we've seen. And that results in, as we've seen with Frisbee Memorial, potential cut to services. And I think in Frisbee in particular, it was maternity services. So it's going to be a widespread impact.
Sam, I want to ask you a quick follow-up, which is you had said earlier, you talked about how changes to eligibility rules, like work requirements, frequent income checks, are potentially coming. And we're also looking at DHHS getting its budget cut here in New Hampshire. So how would this impact the administrative capacity that we have in New Hampshire to deal with these changes in this diminished funding environment?
a great question. Yeah, I think these eligibility rules again really speak to two features of this bill proposed in Congress. One is redeterminations, which we discussed, which is more administrative hurdles, means more pregnant people, people with disabilities, children, et cetera, that are going to be disenrolled from this program. I frankly believe that Congress is banking on more people not being able to go through the process. If you add another step, add another layer, that may be just enough, make it just difficult enough that you're going to have that many more people forego necessary healthcare. I think the second step when you speak to eligibility rules is work requirements. And work requirements is actually a little more interesting because we've been here before. The state of New Hampshire back in 2018, 2019, went through a brief period of attempting to implement work requirements. And it from that particular example, as well as from some other examples around the country in Arkansas, Kentucky, Georgia, we saw that work requirements across the board lead to large scale disenrollment and a steep administrative bill for states. Just for an example, in 2018 in New Hampshire, we were poised to disenroll up to 17,000 people in just 2 months, which is, in my opinion, a startling 67% of those subject to the work requirements. So that's a two-thirds drop in Medicaid expansion, which is bad for the state as a whole and bad for those who are low income in the state. So yeah, it's the administrative burden, the cost of the state, and quite frankly, those who are just going to go without health care. It's a bad deal for the state. It's a bad deal for its citizens.
Christin, anything to add?
I'm just thinking about, where we're facing economic struggles right now as a country, and where is that going? And where is that going for our state? Already, New Hampshire pays a lower minimum wage than the states around us. We have a problem recruiting young people to work in our state and retaining young families. And we're cutting off care to healthcare to services at the same time as goods prices are rising. And we're going to see that happen as a result of the tariffs, wherever they are in their phase right now, right? We're already seeing it happen. But we don't know where the economy might be going. And so for people with, less income coming into their home, that is an additional strain. And who suffers the most from that? Most of the time, it's children.
Inevitably, yes.
Yeah.
Well, for my final question, I think this goes to what comes next. I mean, it would seem like we're facing cuts that are inevitable in Medicaid, not just in DC, but here in Concord. Is there any type of alternative strategy that the state could pursue right now to help to maintain coverage and protect our vulnerable populations and working families if federal Medicaid support declines? Christin, you want to start? Then we'll go to Sam.
Well, I don't know if I have the answer to that, not being the budget expert, but
we wouldn't be on this podcast if we had the answer. Right? We'd be implementing it. Sorry, go ahead.
Right. I think we need to look for other types of, there need to be some other alternatives than taking away from the people that need it the most. I think that's kind of a way to look at it.
Sam, what do you have?
Yeah, no, and I think that's exactly right. I think to Kristin's point, there's a lot of unknowns at play right now. We don't know exactly how all is going to be implemented. We don't know where. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious we're going to see some real financial strain as a result of this. It's just hard to know exactly how that's going to materialize. I think also to Kristin's point, I think what we're going to need is a willingness from the state legislature and also resources. And I think the willingness point first is, as Christin mentioned, there's people in New Hampshire are facing a lot of financial strains right now. If you look to our state legislature, just in this session, there's a proposed increase on premiums for those enrolled in Medicaid expansion and CHIP, as well as pharmacy copay. So not only are we seeing these, to the point of your question, John, not only are we seeing these additional financial strains coming from the federal government, we're seeing additional financial strains imposed by our own state legislature. So if the state is going to step up and fill the gap of once we have these cuts coming from the federal side, before we even talk about resources, there has to be a willingness on the state legislature to want to help those who are facing these financial strains, to want to help those who are going to have their healthcare cut. Beyond that, it's a question of resources and again, stepping up and filling the void. It's hard to know exactly how the state can do that. I mean, one thing that comes to mind when you talk about administrative hurdles of work requirements and redetermination is information, right? The state being those who are going knock on the doors, inform people you're going to have to go to the eligibility office twice a year as opposed to once now. Here are your work requirements. Let me walk you through it. Let me be a resource for you to sort of ensure that you're meeting your requirements. I think that can be one way in which the state can certainly step up and fill the gap once these federal cuts come. But to Kristin's point, there's a lot of unknowns.
And also to Kristen's point, it is tragic that these cuts to essential healthcare to working New Hampshire families are being used to fund tax breaks for huge corporations and the ultra wealthy. Yeah, it doesn't feel right. Well, on that note, I'll ask my colleague Rachel to join us. I know we had some friends in the media sign on to this and see if they've got any questions. And what have you got, Rachel?
Thank you, John, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. Now, if any of our members of the press have questions for our speakers today, I invite you to put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Now, and if you have a question for a specific speaker, you can note that in your question. We do have one question that was submitted ahead of time for both of our speakers today, and that is, the words waste, fraud, and abuse have been used to justify and explain the purpose of these cuts. Can you speak more on this and explain why this claim is false?
I mean, I can speak to it in a sense, which is there is waste, fraud, and abuse in almost every system out there, right? If there's a place where people can take advantage of something, they're going to. Is the waste, fraud, and abuse occurring in the majority from those that the proposed cuts will take the services away from? No, it's not. And it's also very minute. So it's justifying something with an ideal that is not true in the broader sense. And is there waste, fraud, and abuse in the tax system? Is there waste, fraud, and abuse in some of these other systems that the proposed cuts are supposed to enable? It's not a scale where we're balancing it out. We're making an imbalance for those who need services the most. And we're not, in the end, fixing the budget gap because the burden of helping others is going to fall on communities and the people that are stepping up and the organizations that are stepping up now and the other agencies, right? If we take this burden away from one state or federal agency, it ends up falling on another. It's going to fall on emergency services. It's going to fall on local law enforcement. You'll see an increase in the unhoused population. You'll see an increase in behavioral health issues and substance use dependence issues of people that were maybe in recovery. They've lost their services. And it doesn't fix the problem.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think similarly, I think waste, fraud, and abuse is political and rhetorical veneer to justify what, in my opinion, is an attempt to put up administrative hurdles to ensure that more people are disenrolled. But ultimately, I think it's semantics to a large degree. I think you have to look at the results, as Kristin noted, and that's going to be more people without healthcare insurance and more people who face subsequent effects because of that. So it's ultimately that shouldn't really be the fight. The fight should be, what are the effects of this? And that's people who, a disabled person who maybe finds it difficult to drive a second time a year to the local benefits office. Maybe it's someone who, due to a lack of information, doesn't meet the requirements, or maybe he's already working 80 hours a month to meet the work requirements, but doesn't fill out the correct paperwork or check in with the right person. And they're going to be disenrolled and lose necessary health care. So the fight ultimately shouldn't be over semantics. It should be over the effects.
Thank you both. We have a question from Lisa Connell, um, and that is, when will it be known exactly what will be cut and how much? Each day brings more uncertainty. And I'll say off the bat that I don't know if we have a firm date or time on what these cuts will look like, and what day. But, Jaime, would you like to speak more on this?
Well, no, I've put it out to the panel because I think one of the things we've seen this week in news coverage of the E&C committee is a lot of churn and numbers going up and down. Um, Sam, Kristen, have you heard anything about, where this bus is heading and when it's going to get there?
Sam, I'll let you.
Yeah, so I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns. This whole process is unfolding at the pace in which the majority in Congress decides to let it go. I have heard that the internal deadlines the majority party in Congress has set for themselves is Memorial Day to get this out of the House, and then potentially by 4th of July to get it completely wrapped up. I'm not sure if that's possible. I do think there's a lot of reconciliation they have to do within their own party to get this to where it needs to be. I have heard that there is a backstop for the budget reconciliation process, which is sometime in September. So I think they have to get this wrapped up by then. But I think they're aiming to have this done by July, is my understanding.
And I can say that one of the things I've heard in terms of hope is that there are some Republicans who are pushing back, mostly because when we talk about Medicaid cuts, it's not like it disproportionately impacts Democrats or Republicans. There's a lot of supporters of the president who have joined Medicaid expansion, and this would potentially hurt the president's base, especially in rural states. So it's not a way to shore up the base. It's actually a way to erode it. So if there's any hope, I think the more people who speak up and speak out and talk about how important it is that everybody have access to fair and decent health care, maybe this ends differently than it's begun.
Thank you, Jaime, and thank you to both of our speakers for answering these questions today. That's all we have time for, so I will turn it back to Jaime. But if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to reach out to Jaime, and we will help you there. All right, thank you, Jaime.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Sam. Thank you those who joined us and tuned in. This is a difficult issue. It's a lot of money, $715 billion in cuts right now being proposed over 10 years, which could basically shake as much as 1.86 million people at current numbers off of Medicaid by 2034. So a lot to talk about and a lot of impacts socially in terms of our budget, in terms of our communities. So we'll keep looking at this issue. And on behalf of Protect Our Care New Hampshire, thank you for tuning in. It's good to have this conversation.
Thank you.